She arrived blind, alone, and trembling on the frozen platform, expecting a man who'd written her 13 love letters. Instead, he looked her over once and said, "You didn't mention you were blind." Then he vanished. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The station at Dogwood Plains was little more than a wind-battered shelter and a coal-stained bench tucked against the backdrop of wide, empty hills. The sky above it stretched in silence, pale and bruised with the cold. Martha stood still as the last hiss of steam from the train vanished behind her, the cane in her hand trembling faintly. She could not see the way the townsfolk had turned to look, the postman pausing mid-step, the girl with the milk pail slowing as if unsure what she was witnessing. But she felt it. The sudden hush, the weight of eyes. Her gloved fingers curled around the worn wood of her case. The letters sewn into her dress rustled faintly when she moved, as if they too were shivering. Words like darlin' and faithful, and soon stitched into the seams, inked in looping script she could never read but knew by heart. She remembered the sound of his voice on the page. Not his real voice, which she was only now hearing for the first time, but the voice she'd given him. The warm, dependable cadence of a man who'd once written, "I've known hard seasons, but I believe in spring still." He hadn't sounded like that in person. He hadn't offered his arm, hadn't called her by name, only that one sentence. "You didn't mention you were blind." Flat, uneasy, cold. She had practiced what she would say. On the train, in the still dark of morning, she whispered conversations into the air. "It's kind of you to meet me, Mr. Archer." Or, "Thank you for trusting my heart before my face." But now those words seemed too delicate, too soft to survive the frost between them. She stood for a long moment after he left, unsure whether he'd gone back inside or disappeared entirely. Then, slowly, carefully, she walked toward the sound of a door slamming shut. Her boots slid slightly on the icy boards, and the cold reached up through her soles like the fingers of regret. Inside her chest, a quiet voice, one she'd cultivated over decades of being underestimated, spoke gently. "You are not your weakness." And though her jaw trembled, she lifted her chin. The wind caught the hem of her dress as she stepped off the platform, letters brushing her legs like 1,000 whispered hopes. Behind her, the train whistle cried once and was gone. Ahead lay a town that didn't yet want her. But she had come anyway. The attic room smelled of cedar and dust, its one small window sealed against the winter wind and crusted with years of sun and storm. Martha's fingers found the edges of the bed, the slope of the ceiling, the low beam she learned to duck beneath by memory alone. She did not complain. The room was hers, and in it, her breath no longer belonged to a man's approval, but to the rhythm of her own quiet determination. The morning after Caleb vanished, Martha folded her nightdress with practiced precision, the way she used to prepare linens for the children at the orphanage. Neatly, without hurry, as though dignity were something you could weave into cotton. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands still for a long time, listening to the timbers creak and the town stir below. Somewhere, a rooster cried into the wind. Somewhere, someone was laughing. She made her way downstairs with her cane and asked Mrs. Walton, a stout woman with no time for sentiment, if there was any work needing doing. The innkeeper hesitated, then said with a sniff, "You can try the kitchen, if you don't burn the place down." By the end of the week, Martha was kneading dough with graceful confidence, measuring flour by weight and memory. Her hands, trained from years of piano scales, moved with calm, unbroken rhythm. Her biscuits came out golden, soft at the center, and by week 2, they were requested by name. Children lingered in the entryway to smell the cinnamon buns. When Martha heard their hesitance, she invited them near, taught them how to tie letters with twine, to feel the curve of an R with their fingertips. She never raised her voice, never asked for payment. One girl, shy and crooked-toothed, left behind a pressed flower wrapped in handkerchief lace. But the town did not forget. In the mercantile, they still murmured about the woman who arrived blind and alone. "She'll leave by spring," someone said once, loud enough for her to hear. "Or someone'll have to carry her." She said nothing. She did not flinch. Instead, she returned each night to the attic and sewed. Her fingers, roughened and quick, pieced together quilt tops from fabric scraps, blues from old uniforms, reds from sun-bleached dresses, whites from flour sacks, each square a fragment of someone else's story, stitched into something whole. She worked in silence, but every stitch whispered what she would not say aloud. You don't have to see a place to belong to it. Emmett Shaw had lived 5 winters alone on the ridge above Dogwood Plains, where the wind spoke more often than neighbors did. His cabin was modest but solid, a place built for survival, not comfort. And though he had tools, fields, and a mule named Jasper, silence had been his truest companion. Since burying his wife under the cottonwood tree in the back pasture, he had learned to live in a world where nothing surprised him and little moved him. That was before the woman in gray began feeding birds behind the inn. He saw her first from the mercantile porch, Cain leaning beside her, crusts of bread broken in even halves, hands moving with a grace that struck him quiet. She was humming, soft and steady, a tune half lost to time. He didn't recognize the melody, but something in it curled into the hollows of his chest like warm breath on frosted glass. Later that day, he asked Mrs. Walton, with the kind of bluntness that passed for curiosity in men who'd spent too long with cattle and fence posts. "She's the blind bride," the innkeeper said, "the one Archer left." No embellishment, no kindness, just the facts, stacked like cordwood. But Emmett had already seen what others missed. The way she walked, chin level, spine straight, as if she were memorizing the town with her bones. The way children quieted when she spoke to them. The small tilt of her head when listening, like she was catching things no one else heard. When his sister Ada took ill and needed someone to make sense of the swirling handwriting from doctors back east, Emmett went to the inn. He didn't knock at first, just stood outside the door like a boy, unsure whether he'd be welcomed or sent away. When he finally stepped in, Martha looked toward his voice, and her smile was calm, unflinching. No flattery, no surprise, as though she'd already known he would come. She read to Ada with care, steady, measured, never stumbling, and helped arrange medicines by touch, marking each bottle with string and braille dots she carved herself from old wooden beads. Ada called her an angel. Emmett said little, but something softened in his chest each time Martha's hands moved with silent command. The scarf came a week later. His wife had knit it long ago, but it had unraveled at the edge. When Martha returned it, newly mended, the seam was perfect. "How'd you fix it?" he asked, genuinely baffled. Her voice was quiet but steady. "My fingers see better than most eyes." That night, Emmett left a bar of soap on her doorstep. It smelled of clover, the kind his wife used to grow. No note, just a gesture, and from that moment his evenings changed. Firelight, quiet pages turning, her voice describing the swell of a sonata or the ache of a poem. They didn't speak of what was growing, they didn't name it. But he called her Martha, not Miss, not the blind girl, not the one Archer left, just Martha, as if that, in itself, was enough. The morning of the fair dawned with the soft hush of thawed earth, damp with promise. Along the main street of Dogwood Plains, tables unfolded like petals, laden with jars of preserves, skeins of wool, hand-whittled toys, and spring's first hesitant flowers. Children ran in mismatched boots, laughter catching in the breeze. Old men leaned against fence posts, pipe smoke curling up to meet the pale blue sky. Martha stood at the edge of it all, one hand on the handle of her basket, the other on the worn cane that had become as familiar to her as breath. Inside the basket lay 3 quilts, folded with deliberate care, one in prairie golds, one in river blues, and one stitched from remnants of her own journey, pieces of the dress she'd worn on the train, the hem of her orphanage apron, the sash from a borrowed Sunday gown. Every thread was a word she hadn't spoken aloud. Voices rose and fell around her, mostly kind, some murmured behind hands. But it was his voice that split the morning like a dull blade. "I'm just glad I saw sense in time," Caleb Archer was saying to the blacksmith's boy. "Dodged a fine burden, that one. Pretty isn't much good when she can't even walk a pasture or find her way to the barn." Martha's spine stiffened. She didn't need sight to feel the heat of attention swing toward her like a second sun. The shame didn't come in waves. It came as one sharp crack, like dry wood breaking. She steadied herself, mouth pressed into silence. Then, boots. Steady, sure. Emmett. His voice wasn't raised, but it was heard. One word. Enough. It wasn't a command. It was a shield. He didn't look at Caleb. He didn't have to. The weight of it settled into the dust like judgment. Then he turned, not to walk away, but toward her. Martha had not planned to speak. But the question that had lived so long in the quiet between them rose unbidden, fragile as a bird just hatched. "Why do you stay?" Emmett took her hand, the one without the cane, and held it, palm to palm. Yes. That was all. But in that one word lived 1,000 unspoken vows. Yes, to every morning he'd watched her face tilt toward the sun. Yes, to the strength in her fingers, the hush in her voice. Yes, to the firelight and laughter, to burned cornbread and Bach. Yes, to the woman no one claimed, but who claimed herself. They wed beneath the cottonwoods, where light spilled through new leaves like grace finding its way back home. And later, when she wrapped the quilt, the one made of her story, across his shoulders, he touched the stitches with reverence, the way some men touched scripture. "This," he whispered, voice rough with wonder, "this feels like home."